Hello, everybody, and this is Rick, and welcome to Astral Club. The title of this episode will be Reliving an Alien Past Life. When I mention the word reincarnation, my guess is that just about everybody listening to this channel knows what that word means. It means that we have lived before in other bodies, and we will live again. To some people, reincarnation is like a school that their soul goes through where they learn lessons and progress. To others, it's more like a prison. We've discussed some of these topics previously in a very tangential type of way. To be honest with you, I find myself in either school, depending on whether I'm having a good or a bad day that day. So I'm not exactly sure myself what role, in a very grand or larger sense, reincarnation has played and will play in the fate of the human race. However, when I astral projected on one particular occasion, I guess I was thinking about reincarnation. And I thought to myself, well, if I've had many lives here on Earth, is it possible, given my belief that the soul is eternal, is immortal, have I had any lives on any other planets in our galaxy, in our universe? I mean, scientists tell us that just using basic formulas that we can try to guess at what the chance is of life, there has to be life on other planets, on other Earth-like planets, and perhaps planets that aren't Earth-like. Now, most of that life will probably be simple, much like life was simple here on Earth for 99% of this planet's history. You had life that was not self-aware, but fairly basic. So we figure that there's probably similar situations throughout our galaxy and throughout the universe. And that on some of these planets, perhaps intelligent life has evolved. And if that's true, and if the soul is immortal, then perhaps I and you haven't always been here on Earth, because really, from a soul standpoint, it's only been the last million years or so where there were bodies that could have matched the souls that we had to offer. So before that, since the soul is immortal, where were we? Were we somewhere else? Were we experiencing lives in another dimension, on another planet? Who knows? At any rate, when I took that astral projection, I decided to say, I want to find out about a past life that I had on an alien planet. As soon as I held that thought in my mind, I found myself moving very quickly. And after a period of blackness, I found myself in a body that was extremely alien. I guess you could best describe it as a giant flying insect. Surrounding me, high over deep canyons, were a swarm of my brothers. I guess they were approximately 3.5 to 4 feet long, which is about 1 to 1.2 meters, with wingspans about twice that size. I say brothers because I could smell, using, I guess, probably pheromones, that there were no females in our immediate soaring group. They were, however, I knew, somewhere else close by, watching us. Now, before I get further into my experience, I have to explain to you what my consciousness was like. It was like I had two consciousness is I had two minds, if you will. I had the mind that existed at that time on that world in that creature. And I could sense, I could recognize that there was something that was familiar to me. Something, some small part that I might today recognize as Rick. And so I had that brain, but there was also the modern day Rick, my super consciousness, if you will. That was present as well. And it was kind of like watching a movie, only probably the most realistic movie you've ever experienced. Because not only could I see what that creature was seeing, I could think like it was thinking, I could feel the winds, I could sense the excitement and the other emotions. So it was almost like I was, in a very real sense, auditing the experience once again. So, in my group, there was about 100 or so adolescents, and they were preparing for a rite of passage. And I guess it was all about impressing the ladies, if I can use that term, by demonstrating our strength, flying skills, and bravery by rocketing through the canyons of trial. Now, keep in mind, I'm trying to come up with English words that best convey that experience. I mean, those creatures didn't have language like we do, but I'm trying to develop English words that capture the experience, the spirit of the experience, the feeling, the emotions of it. So, Canyons of Trial was my best guess at that. Anyway, after those that survived and passed this test would become mature swarm members, and they would then join the females to mate in a swirling dance of passion in the air. Cowards refusing the test would be condemned to never mate, and they would live on the fringes of the tribe as juveniles forever. Those that failed would litter the canyon floor with their desiccated remains. Now, to us, the tribe was everything. Without the tribe, you'd never survive the creeping hunters or the fires that occurred whenever there was a thunderstorm. Banishment from the tribe was the worst penalty for violating our customs and laws. Although it was rarely dark, we had twin suns that kept the world in bright sunlight to a dim twilight. We still needed to sleep regularly. The tribe would nest in, I guess, giant fern-like plants that were many feet or meters tall. There weren't any trees like we think of trees. They were kind of these giant ferns. That's the best way I can describe them. Now, those with the highest status and the females occupied the upper branches. The male juveniles, like myself, and lower caste members slept in the more hazardous bottom branches, where we took turns on watch for the hunters and other assorted dangers inhabiting our lands. When danger was sighted by those on watch, an alarm pheromone would be secreted, and it would quickly be relayed to the entire tribe. And then there'd be an emergency exodus, which would then be initiated, where we'd all follow the leader to a safer resting place. Now, during those rare times when both suns disappeared beneath the horizon, death was almost a certainty. Inevitably, those creeping hunters that I'm telling you about would see us in the dark, and they would find and attack our night quarters. The pheromones secreted then were those of panic, pain, despair, as one of our brothers were snatched away to be sucked dry by these horrible creatures. We would sometimes find their crumpled corpses on the forest floor when the light returned. Our tribe was self-aware and intelligent, but we had no tools or indeed anything like opposable thumbs. I would say probably that our people were on par with primitive humanoid species in intelligence before fire was harnessed. So we're probably talking before 1,000,000 years from a standpoint of development. Very primitive. we didn't have any elected leaders. Rather, the older and more experienced adults led us through winding scent trails to the large flowering plants during the time they were ripe and sweet with nectar. And those scent trails, as I'm remembering this experience, were so vivid. It was like you and I today following a golden trail marked out with, the yellow brick road. It was that easy to follow. Now, I know we as humans have very poor smell because we use other senses, but to these creatures, to this past Rick, if you will, scent was extremely important. It was how we communicated the world. It was how we observed much of the world. Yes, we had sight, but it was a very basic type of sight. It was, I would say, not as good as human sight is, but it was that scent that detected our world and helped us to survive. Now, our world was full of jungles, and they had many delicate, lovely, and juicy plants. Now, of course, the canyons of the high plateau on this world were much different. They were devoid of any succulent greenery, having only life forms that we might compare to earth moss or lichens. High winds whipped through those crags, and they were cold in the dim times of the year when the suns were very dim. And they were warm during the bright days high above in the sky, where there was like one large sun, and then there was another sun that was about a quarter of its size. So it was, definitely a two-star system. Anyway, both of these stars kept us in light and warmth, and it helped to support the abundant life that seemed to be everywhere. It was just a very living type planet, greenery everywhere. The plants were different than the ones we have here, but there was a lot of greenery. Even now, though, in the brief cold season was giving way to the warmer times, and I could sense that, and I understood that the brief cold season was leaving, that the warm times were coming. The temperature fluctuations would cause whirlwinds sometimes of all sizes to form spontaneously, and then they would dissipate just as quickly. The winds posed little danger early in the warm season. However, when the warm times were older, the tribe had to be careful as they flew to avoid being caught up in sudden and very savage storms. I had seen many brothers and sisters torn apart when carelessly caught within the swirling and treacherous windstorms. But now I started focusing on where I was at that particular moment. And I saw, as I hovered above, waiting for the first of my brothers to begin that steep dive into the canyons of trial, I felt a sense of awe, excitement, and a very real undercurrent of fear. For it wasn't just the breakneck speed that we had to dive into those canyons that I feared. It was the things that were crawling about far below that we called the creeping hunters. They had these web snares that were spread haphazardly throughout the entire canyon system. I would say that they were probably most like earth spiders today. I mean, they didn't look exactly like our spiders, but they kind of occupied that niche, I think, in our ecosystem. They were dark and black. They were larger than us too. Remember, we were 3 to 4 feet long, and they were larger than us. And they fed off us much like the spiders do in on Earth. And by the way, I do have arachnophobia a little bit, so maybe you'll understand why as I finish with my experience. Anyway, normally these creatures, these black predator creatures, were found throughout our world. They were very solitary normally. But during this particular time of the year, they would come together because they knew something was going to happen. And then they would feast on those who failed our adolescent trial. It kind of reminds me of when I was watching this nature special, and these large African crocodiles were all, normally they would be all spread throughout the river system, but they happened to know somehow that this was the time of year when when a lot of the African wildlife, the gazelle, what have you, would bound across the river and go to another part of Africa for the various seasons. And anyway, all these crocs would gather in that same area. And as the gazelle and all the other creatures went across the river, they'd capture some and have themselves a terrible little feast. At any rate, I could see these black hunters skittering about on their webs far below, readying themselves eagerly to grow fat on our life fluids. Now, the first three brothers, sensing that the time had come to start this age-old ritual, and this was an age-old ritual. No one could remember a time before this was our ritual. Anyway, they went into steep dives. I and several others folded in our wings and dove behind them. The trick to surviving the dive, I knew, was to fly at a maximum safe speed. At that blinding pace, the webs were easily broken through. Go too fast, however, and you'd tear a wing or lose control. High-speed crashes onto the jagged rocky floor claimed many of my winged brethren as well. Their decaying corpses littering the canyon floor, testaments to their bravery and to their failure. Flying too slowly, of course, and you'd become entangled in the deadly webs. And everyone knew that once you became trapped in the hunter's snares, you'd never rejoin the tribe. The lead brother performed very skillfully. He easily ripped through the white webbing, and I was happy for him. The second was close on his tail and succeeded as well. I was only a few seconds behind the third tribesman when disaster struck. One of the hunters had crawled out onto the web mid-span and was rearing its hideously bulbous body up menacingly. Now, number three cut his speed in fear. He lost his nerve, and vainly he tried to pull up. But he was going much too fast for this kind of desperate maneuver. He collided into the creature's web full on and became stuck. I briefly thought of pulling up and saving myself, but I decided to collide with my brother in an effort to knock him out of the clutches of those dark creatures that were now eagerly skittering towards him. My body slammed into him a split second later. White-hot pain filled my senses. I felt this creature's pain in a very real sense. Unfortunately, my impact wasn't enough to free him from the sticky web. Horrified and in shock, I realized that now I was entangled in this very same gossamer trap. My final sight was of that spidery, creeping hunter rearing up and sinking its fangs deep into my battered torso. As I drifted out of this physical form, and it was interesting because it was like there was two of me drifting out, I saw our attackers feasting on my now abandoned body and that of my brother far below. When I returned to my earth body, I thought about the lessons of that life. Our tribe was simple and uncomplicated, but we functioned as a unit that depended and worked together. It was a simple and fairly short life, but I think I learned the lessons of trust, bravery, and unity. So that was the very curious alien past life experience that I sought after a number of years ago when I astral projected. I must say, I guess I wasn't quite expecting something like that. I think I've watched way too much Star Trek, where every alien is basically a humanoid with maybe just some extra antennae or perhaps a different color skin. So I wasn't completely prepared for the very alien stimuli and the very alien way of thinking that I was confronted with in this giant flying insect and his tribal members. However, it did answer a question that I'd had for quite some time, which is if our souls are indeed immortal and if they've been around forever. And we know the earth hasn't been around forever, and we certainly know that humanoid species and the particular branch of that represents our particular species has not been around forever. So, if our souls are immortal and these bodies are relatively new, at least in galactic or universal standards, then it stands to reason that we would have had experiences on other worlds. And this particular one was certainly extremely thought provoking for me. And it caused me to think much more about myself and how I'm part of my family, how I'm part of my own work groups, and the human species as a whole. I guess put things a little bit more in perspective, because we Americans especially are very individualistic, and we don't always think of ourselves as part of a wider community. Now, currently we're in the middle of a situation here where I think for the first time a lot of us are thinking of our fates as compared to those and as dependent upon the rest of our people in our own little nation states, as well as the human race as a whole. And I think we're learning that we have to band together if we want to survive and to progress. Well, that was this particular experience. I hope it was interesting for you. If it was, please hit the like button. If you think someone else would appreciate this, share it with them. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. If you have, hit that bell button so you'll get notifications whenever I post a new video. I'm Rick, and as always, I will see you on the astral plane.